Welcome to Life Stories, where every story holds a powerful lesson and every journey teaches us something new. Today, we delve into the heartbreaking yet inspiring tale of love, loss, and self-discovery. Follow the path of James, a man who sacrifices everything for success, only to realize too late the true value of what he's lost. Meanwhile, Hannah, the woman he cast aside, rises from the ashes to build a life filled with strength, purpose, and love. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to begin today's story with us. Let's explore these profound life lessons together. James Taylor had everything, a life filled with luxury, connections in high places, and the kind of success many people could only dream of. But for all his achievements, there was one thing he had never truly understood: the value of love. Not just any love, but the deep, unwavering love of Hannah Grant, the woman he had once vowed to cherish. Hannah had been his anchor, his warmth, the quiet place he could always return to. But in his pursuit of more wealth, more power, more prestige, he took her love for granted, never realizing its worth until it was too late. Hannah was not from a world like James's. She came from Oak Ridge, a small town where life was simple. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and everyone knew your name. But to James, that was part of her charm. Her warmth, her simplicity, was what had drawn him in when they first met. She was the kind of woman who believed in love, real, unconditional love, the kind that could overcome any obstacle, heal any wound, and bridge any gap. When she met James, she thought she had found her happily ever after. He was everything she had never known: ambitious, sharp-witted, and driven. He had dreams so big they could have touched the sky. And despite his humble beginnings, he fought his way into the world of the wealthy and powerful. To Hannah, he seemed to have it all. But as their relationship deepened and they married, the glittering exterior of their life began to show cracks. It wasn't immediate, of course. At first, she believed in him, in them. She believed that the love they had would be enough. After all, wasn't love supposed to conquer all? She thought they could face anything together, even his ambitious drive to climb higher and higher in society. She stood by him, unwavering, patient, forgiving, and always in the background, ready to support him. She cooked his favorite meals, ensured his shirts were always neatly pressed, and greeted him with warmth every time he came home. In the early years of their marriage, he had loved her back, truly, with a passion that made her feel like she was the most important person in the world. But slowly, the love that had once burned brightly began to dim. The changes were subtle at first. James's gaze became less affectionate, more indifferent. The excitement he once had for their life together started to fade, replaced by long hours at the office and an increasing number of nights spent away from home. Their conversations grew shorter, and the tender moments they once shared disappeared entirely. At first, Hannah told herself it was just stress. He was working hard. After all, he had big dreams, and the future they had always imagined was within reach. She told herself he would come back to her when it was all over. But deep down, she began to feel the quiet rejection. It wasn't something she could name at first, but it was there, a deep sense of being neglected, being pushed aside. The invitations to social events, once so frequent, became fewer and fewer. When she asked if she could accompany him to one of the prestigious galas, he hesitated before finally saying, "It's not really your scene, Hannah." His words stung, but she didn't argue. Instead, she tried to change, to become the kind of woman who could fit into his new world. She watched the women around him, learned how they dressed, how they carried themselves, how they spoke with effortless confidence. She practiced walking in heels, learned how to apply makeup the way women in high society did, and even tried to follow financial news so she could talk to him about his work. But no matter what she did, it was never enough. She tried harder, but he never seemed to notice. The hurt began to build, but she clung to hope, believing that if she just held on long enough, things would get better. One evening, during a rare dinner together, she brought up a recent business deal she had read about, hoping to spark a conversation. James barely glanced up from his phone and said, "You don't have to try so hard. This stuff isn't for you." The words crushed her, but she smiled. forcing herself to appear unaffected. She began to see it, how she had become invisible in his world. At gatherings, she could feel the weight of judgmental glances from his mother, Helen Taylor, and the other women in their social circle. They spoke around her, as if she were not even there. Helen's remarks, though subtle, were sharp enough to wound. "Some women just don't have the refinement for our world," she had once said at a charity luncheon. And James had heard it. He had seen the way Hannah's hands trembled as she reached for her glass. But he had said nothing. That night, Hannah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had changed so drastically. She thought back to the days when James used to hold her hand in public, when he had looked at her as if she were the best thing that had ever happened to him. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. The distance between them grew every day. And with each passing moment, she began to understand the truth. She wasn't the woman James wanted anymore. She had become a reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind. She wasn't blind. She could see the way he avoided her touch, the way his expression hardened whenever she spoke. There were nights when he wouldn't even come home. And when she asked where he had been, his answers were clipped, impatient. Yet she held on. She convinced herself that it was just a phase. That once James reached the success he craved, he would return to her, the man she had once married. But what Hannah didn't realize was that James had already made his choice. The love he once had for her wasn't buried beneath the weight of ambition, it was gone, replaced by something else entirely. This is where Hannah's story truly begins. And the journey ahead will be one of profound loss, painful realizations, and ultimately, unexpected redemption. The moment Hannah realized the truth, that James had made his choice and that it wasn't her, was a sharp, soul-crushing blow. She had spent so many years believing that love could overcome anything, even the distance that was steadily growing between them. But the cruel reality was now clear. James no longer saw her as the woman he once loved. She had become an inconvenience, a reminder of a past that no longer fit into the image he was trying to build for himself. In the months that followed, Hannah tried to hold on, hoping that things would eventually get better. But deep down, she knew it was futile. The conversations with James became less frequent, and his presence in their shared life became more and more distant. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. There was no warmth in his eyes, no tenderness in his touch. Instead, there was indifference, painful, cold indifference. Hannah, desperate to make things work, began changing herself. She had always prided herself on being genuine, on embracing her simple, small-town roots. But now, those qualities seemed to only drive James further away. She thought that if she could just become someone more suited to his new life, maybe, just maybe, he would love her again. She watched the women in his social circle, studying their every move, the way they spoke, the way they dressed. They were polished, sophisticated, part of a world she had never been exposed to before. And she felt an overwhelming urge to belong. She began learning how to walk in heels without tripping, how to wear makeup that would highlight her best features, how to engage in conversations about high society and the business world that James had come to admire so much. She studied the pages of financial news, trying to understand the conversations that flew over her head at dinner parties. She hoped that these changes would win his approval. But no matter how much she transformed, it never seemed to be enough. When she finally mustered the courage to ask him about a recent business deal she had read about, expecting it to lead to a meaningful conversation, James barely glanced up from his phone. "You don't have to try so hard. This stuff isn't for you," he said dismissively. His words pierced her heart. But she forced herself to smile. She held back the tears, convincing herself that she just needed to try harder. Despite her efforts, the distance between them continued to widen. She no longer fit into the world he had built. She was the small-town girl who didn't belong, who didn't know how to speak the right way or dress the right way. And even though James had promised her that love was enough, he had abandoned her, choosing ambition over the woman who had once been the center of his world. The ultimate betrayal came one evening, when James came home late after yet another gala, an event that, like all the others, she had been excluded from. He had come back to their lavish home, his eyes distant, his smile absent, There was a coldness about him that Hannah couldn't ignore. She asked him about his evening. But his response was curt. Dismissive. It was as though she no longer existed in his world. He didn't even apologize for leaving her alone again. Hannah felt herself breaking, piece by piece. But she was determined not to show it. She didn't want to let him see how much his indifference hurt. She still loved him, more than she had ever loved anyone. But the love she had given so freely, the love that had once been enough to bridge any gap, was now something he barely acknowledged. The months continued to blur together, each one more painful than the last. James's behavior only worsened, and the woman who had once been his proud wife became invisible to him. Relegated to the background of his life. She began to notice how easily he turned his attention to other women, women who fit into the world he was so desperately trying to be a part of. She saw it in his eyes when they were at social gatherings. He no longer saw her as his equal, as his partner. She was a reminder of a past he was trying to leave behind. And even though she tried to cling to the hope that things would change, she began to realize, deep within her, that the man she had once loved, her James, was no longer the same. As the months dragged on, Hannah began to fade into the background of their marriage. She was no longer the woman James turned to for support, for love, for warmth. She had become nothing more than a fixture in his life, someone to keep up appearances, to fill the role of a wife when it suited him. And yet, even as her heart was breaking, she refused to leave. She still believed in their love, still held on to the hope that one day, James would return to her, that he would realize what he had given up. But as the days wore on, she began to see the truth. James wasn't coming back. He had already moved on. And she was left behind, clinging to a love that had long since faded. She had given him everything, her heart, her soul, her devotion, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. She wasn't enough. This was the beginning of her journey, one of profound loss, but also one of self-discovery. Hannah didn't know it yet, but she would soon find the strength to rise from the ashes of her broken marriage and rebuild her life. Piece by piece, she would discover the power of self-love, the importance of believing in herself, and, most importantly, that sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing when to let go. As the months turned into years, James's decisions began to take their toll on everyone around him. He had spent so long chasing success, grasping for the status and recognition that came with it, that he failed to notice the damage he was causing. The love of his life, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, was crumbling. But in his world, the climb to the top was everything, and he couldn't see beyond the next step forward. James had convinced himself that he was making the right choices. Leaving Hannah, the woman who had once been his anchor, was nothing more than a necessary step for his future. She was too simple, too small town, too ordinary for the life he had envisioned. He wanted someone who could walk into a room and command attention. Someone who belonged to the elite circles of high society. Hannah was never going to fit into that world, and he was sure that she would fade into nothing without him. But he was wrong. The deeper James sank into the high-powered world he had worked so hard to enter, the more he distanced himself from the person he had once been. He had transformed into someone he barely recognized, a man who had become so absorbed in his own ambition that he lost sight of everything else. He had never understood the kind of love Hannah had given him, nor the sacrifice it had taken to be the woman he needed. And now, with every passing day, he only became more consumed with guilt. Even as he tried to suppress it, it wasn't just the neglect of Hannah's love that was destroying their marriage. It was the quiet arrogance that had taken over James's character. He was no longer the man who had looked at her with warmth, the man who had once been proud to call her his wife. He had become someone else, a man who saw her as an obstacle to his ambitions, a reminder of a life he was eager to leave behind. As his career and social standing grew, his feelings for her shrank, replaced by the hunger for more power, more recognition, and, eventually, someone who could fit his new image. And then there was Vanessa Harris, the woman who had silently slipped into his life. Vanessa was everything Hannah wasn't: sophisticated, cultured, polished, and deeply ingrained in the high society James so desperately craved. It didn't take long for her to notice the cracks in his marriage. And like a predator, she waited for the right moment to slip in and claim the position that Hannah had once held. James was too blind to see the betrayal unfolding before him. He was so focused on the rewards of his career and the facade of perfection that he ignored the growing distance between him and the woman who had once been his partner in life. Vanessa, with her carefully crafted charm, was just the escape he needed. She whispered the right words in his ear, promised him the life he had dreamed of, and made him forget the quiet, unassuming love of his wife. Hannah, on the other hand, felt the change in him long before it became obvious. She saw the way he looked at her when they were together. The look that once conveyed tenderness now only held frustration, disappointment, and even a hint of disdain. When she asked him if something was wrong, he would brush her off with excuses, his work, his stress, the endless demands on his time. But she knew that he was slipping away, and no amount of trying on her part would ever bring him back. Despite the heartbreak, Hannah clung to the belief that love was enough. She tried to change, tried to become the woman she thought James wanted. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't change who she was. She couldn't transform herself into the kind of woman who would stand by his side without feeling the weight of his indifference. She was losing herself in the process, trying to fit into a world that never wanted her. And all the while, James was moving further away from her, his heart no longer in their marriage. It was in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, that Hannah began to understand the reality of their situation. James wasn't just distancing himself from her, he was letting go entirely. The man she had married, the man who had once promised to love her through everything, was slipping away into a life that didn't have room for her. And though it broke her, though it shattered her sense of self, Hannah realized that she could no longer hold on to something that wasn't there. Her resilience, the strength she had always kept hidden deep within, began to stir. She was no longer just the woman who had followed James's dreams. She was her own person, and she needed to start living for herself. The quiet acceptance of being discarded began to turn into something more powerful, an awakening. She would no longer be the woman who faded into the background of someone else's life. She was going to find her own path, one that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Especially not someone who had already cast her aside. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be the hardest thing she had ever done. But for the first time in years, Hannah knew something had to change. And that change started with her. The woman she was becoming was far stronger than the woman who had once believed that love alone could fix everything. It was time to take control of her own life. James Taylor had always believed that his success was the only thing that mattered. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificing time, relationships, and his own well-being, all in the pursuit of wealth and power. He was sure that these would be his ultimate validation, that they would prove he was better, more deserving than anyone else. But what he never expected, what he never saw coming, was the price of his choices. And as the empire he had worked so hard to build began to crumble, so did everything else. It started with the small things. Discrepancies in the financial reports. Signs that something was wrong. But James refused to acknowledge them. He had built Taylor Enterprises from the ground up. And he convinced himself that these were just minor setbacks. Things that could be fixed with a bit more effort. A bit more time. But the truth was impossible to ignore. The cash flow problems. The mounting debts. These were not just mistakes. They were symptoms of a larger issue. And all the while, Vanessa Harris, the woman he had become so deeply involved with, had been quietly plotting her escape. James had thought she was his ally, his partner in this world of high society, someone who would help him secure his place among the elite. But Vanessa was no different from the others who had used him. She was an opportunist, and she had been waiting for the right moment to jump ship. As Taylor Enterprises showed more and more signs of instability, Vanessa began to discreetly move her investments into a rival corporation, cutting her losses before the inevitable collapse. James never saw it coming. He was too absorbed in his own world, too focused on his image and his standing in the business community. He didn't even realize that Vanessa had been using him for her own gain, feeding him just enough to keep him in her grasp while making sure she was always one step ahead. And when the inevitable did happen, when the financial collapse came, it was swift. Brutal and unrelenting. The media didn't hesitate to tear James apart. Headlines splashed across newspapers, detailing his failures, his poor decisions, and the woman who had left him in the dust. He had been so blinded by ambition that he had allowed a woman like Vanessa to deceive him. In the blink of an eye, Taylor Enterprises was bankrupt, its stock plummeting, its future uncertain. James was no longer a respected figure in the business world, he was a joke. A cautionary tale for those who believed they could control everything. The final blow came when the board of directors, who had once hailed him as a visionary, turned on him. The accusations were swift and damning: negligence, poor leadership, reckless spending, and perhaps the most painful of all, the revelation that Vanessa had been siphoning funds and moving them elsewhere. It wasn't just the loss of his company that hurt, it was the realization that he had been so blinded by his ambition that he couldn't even see the betrayal that had been happening right under his nose. As James stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had built, the weight of his mistakes began to settle in. He had lost everything: his company, his wealth, his reputation. But there was one thing he hadn't expected to lose. One thing he had never thought he would be without: Hannah. Meanwhile, Hannah was finding her own way. As James's world crumbled, hers was slowly being rebuilt. Piece by piece, she had endured the worst of it. The heartbreak, the humiliation, the silence. But through it all, she had never given up on herself. She had found the strength to move forward, to rise from the ashes of her failed marriage. And now, she was flourishing. Hannah had always been resourceful, capable, and determined. She had spent so many years pouring herself into James, believing that their love would be enough to overcome anything. But as she began to move on, she realized something profound. Love wasn't enough if it wasn't mutual. Love couldn't survive on one person's efforts alone. And as painful as it had been to walk away from the life she had built with James, she knew it was the right thing to do. Her business, once a dream she had never dared to speak aloud, was now thriving. She had found a new sense of purpose in her work, in building something that was entirely her own. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And as her company grew, so did her sense of self. She was no longer the woman James had cast aside. She was her own person, a successful, independent woman who had worked hard to create the life she deserved. But perhaps the most surprising part of her transformation was the love she had found, not with a man, but with herself. She had spent so many years thinking that her worth was tied to James, to the man who had promised to love her. But now she understood that her worth had always been within her. She was not defined by James's choices or by the life they had once shared. She was defined by her own strength, her own resilience, and her own ability to rebuild. As the weeks passed, Hannah's business continued to grow, and her life seemed to take on a new rhythm, one that was all her own. She had found peace in the chaos, strength in her vulnerability, and, most importantly, a sense of purpose. For James, the lessons came too late. The pride he had clung to for so long was now a burden too heavy to bear. His downfall had been swift, but his regrets were slow, creeping in with every moment of silence, every lonely night spent in his empty mansion. The woman he had discarded had not only survived without him, she had thrived. And for the first time in his life, James began to see the truth. It had never been about the money or the power. It had always been about the love he had taken for granted. Hannah, on the other hand, had learned something far more valuable. She had learned that love was not something to be taken lightly. It wasn't something to be used as a bargaining chip or to gain status. Love, she realized, was a gift, one that had to be given and received with respect. And the love she had given James had not been enough to keep him from his own selfish choices. But that didn't mean it wasn't enough for her. And now, as she stood in the glow of her success, she understood something even deeper: she had always been enough. James stood in the midst of his crumbling world, his empire shattered, the grand life he had fought so tirelessly for slipping through his fingers like sand. The failure of Taylor Enterprises was only the beginning. And with every day that passed, it became increasingly clear to him that nothing in his life had been as it seemed. His fall from grace was swift and brutal, And as he watched the destruction of everything he had once thought important, he began to understand the full weight of his mistakes. Maxwell had always believed that his wealth and status were the defining markers of his success. He had convinced himself that by accumulating more, by constantly reaching for something higher, he would find fulfillment. But all of that had come crashing down in a matter of months. Vanessa Harris, the woman he had turned to after discarding Hannah, had disappeared without a trace, leaving him with nothing but the painful remnants of his pride. The moment he realized that Vanessa had betrayed him, that she had been using him all along, was the hardest pill to swallow. He had been so blinded by ambition, so sure that his power would shield him from failure, that he hadn't noticed the people closest to him slipping away. Vanessa's abandonment was the final blow. But it wasn't the worst of his realizations. The worst realization was that he had not only lost his company, his wealth, and his social standing, but he had also lost the one person who had truly mattered, the woman who had always loved him unconditionally. Hannah. In the quiet, lonely moments of his downfall, James thought about her constantly. He thought about the way she had looked at him in those final days of their marriage, how she had tried so hard to make things work. To understand his world, she had given him everything, and he had discarded her without a second thought. Now, standing at the edge of his ruin, he finally understood what it meant to lose someone truly important, and it tore him apart. Hannah had always been the one constant in his life, the one person who had loved him without condition. She had never demanded anything more from him than what he was willing to give. She had been the grounding force that kept him tethered to something real, something meaningful. But in his arrogance, in his desperate hunger for more, he had taken her for granted. He had assumed that she would always be there, that her love would remain unshaken by his neglect. But she hadn't waited for him to come back. She hadn't waited for him to realize his mistakes. She had moved on, and in doing so, she had become something he never thought possible, a woman who no longer needed him. Hannah's transformation had been a slow and steady one, but it was clear now that she had become someone entirely different from the woman he had once known. She had rebuilt her life, started her own business, and found a strength that James could never have imagined. She was no longer the meek, patient woman who had put up with his arrogance. She was strong, independent, and thriving, everything he had never expected her to become. And what hurt James the most, what stung deeper than the loss of his wealth or status, was that Hannah hadn't just survived without him, she had flourished. She had become someone beyond the role he had tried to define her by. She had found her own path, and in doing so, she had discovered a kind of peace that he could never have imagined for himself. The regret James felt was a heavy, suffocating weight. It wasn't just the regret of losing Hannah, it was the regret of not truly understanding her worth. He had spent so much of his life chasing after things that would never bring him happiness, thinking that power, money, and status were the keys to fulfillment. But in the end, it wasn't those things that mattered. It was love. It was the deep, abiding connection he had shared with Hannah, the kind of love that could withstand anything. And he had thrown it all away. But now it was too late. He had no way of going back. The life he had built for himself, the life that he had believed was the pinnacle of success, was nothing but a distant memory. He had lost everything, and there was no way to reclaim what he had thrown away. Meanwhile, Hannah had found something far more valuable than anything James had ever offered her, herself. She had learned the hard lesson that love could not be built on one-sided sacrifice. She had learned that in order to love someone else, she first had to love and respect herself. She had finally realized that her worth was not defined by the love of another person. Especially not someone who had discarded her so easily. As Hannah moved forward in her life, building her business and forging new connections, she felt a sense of peace settle over her that James would never understand. She was no longer tethered to him, no longer waiting for him to see her worth. She had already seen it for herself. And that was all that mattered. For James, however, the pain of his choices would continue to haunt him. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had been his everything, had moved on without him. And now, as he watched from the sidelines, he understood the true cost of taking love for granted. The greatest punishment was not suffering or revenge, it was the realization that the person you once discarded had flourished without you. And you were nothing but a forgotten chapter in their story. As James stood alone in the ruins of his life, surrounded by the crumbling remnants of his past, he finally understood the profound lesson that had eluded him for so long. He had spent his life chasing power, wealth, and validation, believing these were the things that would give him fulfillment. But in the end, it was love that mattered most, and he had thrown it all away. Meanwhile, Hannah thrived. She had built a life on her own terms, free from the shadows of the man who had once discarded her. Her strength, resilience, and unwavering belief in herself had led her to a place of peace and success that James would never know. She had moved on, leaving the past behind, and found happiness in herself, in her work, and in the family she had created. As James watched from afar, he realized that the most painful regret of all wasn't losing his wealth or status. It was losing the one person who had truly loved him. Hannah had risen from the ashes, and he, in his pursuit of more, had only sunk deeper into the mire of his own mistakes. There was no redemption for him now, only the cold, bitter truth that he had lost everything that truly mattered. The greatest lesson life could teach came through loss. Love is not something to be taken for granted. It must be nurtured, cherished, and respected. James had learned this too late. But for Hannah, the journey had only just begun. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful life stories. Stay tuned for more chapters that remind us of the profound lessons life never fails to teach.